I'd like to call to order this meeting of the Camarillo City Council. It's 4 p.m. And can we have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Kildy?
Here.
Councilmember Martinez-Bravo?
Here.
Councilmember Tennyson?
Present.
Vice Mayor Tremblay is absent for the record, and Mayor Santangelo.
Here. The purpose for us opening at 4 p.m. is to go into closed session. I'll ask the city attorney to read the closed session item.
Yes, Mayor and Council, we have one item on the agenda, conference with labor negotiators, and if there was any reportable action, I will make that report at the end of the City Council meeting. Thank you.
Thank you. With that, we'll recess to closed session.
Okay. I'd like to call to order the meeting of the Camarillo Board of Library Trustees. Let the record reflect that all council members are present. Would Council Member Kildee please lead us in the flag salute?
Place your right hand over your heart. Ready, begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Okay, we will move to the approval of the agenda. Are there any amendments to the agenda? Okay, seeing none, we will move to general public comments. Is there anyone that would like to address the library board? Okay, seeing none, we will close the public comments and move on to the consent calendar. Can I please get a motion and a second to approve the consent calendar, which are our minutes?
Second.
Thank you. Please vote. Okay, and that passes unanimously. We will now move to our discussion items. We have library activity updates. Do we have staff to present that? Thank you.
Good afternoon, Madam President and fellow library trustees. Hello, my name is Megan Profeta, and I am the Business Services Coordinator for the Russell Fisher Business Collection. We call it the RFBC at the Camarillo Public Library. I'm excited to share about an upcoming event that the RFBC is sponsoring. We have author and speech coach Samara Bay giving an author talk on her book, Permission to Speak, at the Camarillo Public Library on July 22nd at 2 p.m. That's the book that you'll see in front of you. Permission to Speak is a flawless example of what the Russell Fisher Business Collection has to offer. It's a modern business resource that's applicable to every professional. I recommend Permission to Speak for anyone who's looking for practical advice about speaking in public, for those who are curious about the social science behind some of our speaking habits, and for anyone who has felt like they had to change how they speak to fit in or to be heard. I found Samara's advice and research thought-provoking regarding the difference between how I speak and how we think powerful people should speak. Samara Bay, she coaches clients including top actors in Hollywood, C-suite execs, thought leaders, candidates for U.S. Congress, and celebrities presenting at award shows and at the UN. Her work on rethinking the sound of power has been featured in the New York Times Magazine, Time, CBS Morning, Tamron Hall, Fast Company, and Create and Cultivate. She happens to live in Los Angeles with her husband, son, and dog Moxie. The library has several copies of this book available both in print and e-format. And I also want to point out that Permission to Speak is being highlighted because it's the RFBC's pick for the library's summer reading program. In that book, you'll see a printout of the summer reading program agenda. The theme for this year's summer reading program is Find Your Voice. I could not have found a better fitting book for the RFBC and this theme. It is literally a modern business resource about finding your voice, pun intended. Speaking of the summer reading program, the RFBC will have its own challenge and incentives for patrons. The challenge will include engaging with the collection's books, databases, and the small business community. The incentives are gift cards purchased from the local small businesses. All of this is to align with the RFBC's mission of supporting local small business community. We invite the community to participate in the RFBC Summer Reading Challenge. It's running from June 17th to August 19th, and we hope you are all able to attend the Samara Bay Author Talk at the Camarillo Public Library on July 22nd at 2 p.m. That concludes my report, and I'm happy to address any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments for staff? Okay. Seeing none, thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
This is a receive and file item, and thank you for the update. We will move to oral communications. Are there any oral communications for the library board? Okay. Seeing none, I will move to adjourn this meeting.
All right, I'd like to call the Camarillo Sanitary District regular board meeting to order, please, and let the record reflect that all directors are present except one. approval of the agenda here, so we'll get down to general public comments on the Sand District. Any public comments on the Sand District? Okay, so we'll get down to the consent calendar items.
Move approval.
I'll second.
There's a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion? Hearing none, please vote. That passes 4-1 with one absence. Okay, that's going to get us down to item F. It's actually a public hearing. It's the pretreatment program for Operations Code Local Limits Ordinance Introduction. Do we have a staff report on that?
Yes, thank you.
Let me turn the mic on, I guess.
Our Superintendent of the Sanitary District, Darren Carter, will be presenting the item.
Thank you.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and members of council. I'm here this evening to present the Camarillo Sanitary District Local Limits Update. Now, to give you a little bit of background on our local limits that we currently have in place were established in 1999. Now, there was a need to update our local limits because of upgrades to the treatment plant over the years. There was changing regulations, and there was changes to our industrial user base since those limits were put in place in 1999. So we worked on preparing draft local limits. It was supported to the regional board on November of 2021, and we received approval from the water board in March of 2023. Now, many people ask, what are the purpose of local limits? And that's a very interesting question. The purpose is to protect the operation of the plant from upset and interference. We also want to prevent the pass-through of toxic pollutants. We don't want anything coming into the plant that we can't treat and then going through the plant. So that's what those local limits do. We also want to prevent contamination of our biosolids. We want to prevent anything from being in our recycled water quality. And also, last but not least, we want to protect the infrastructure and human health and safety. So that's the purpose of the local limits. Now, this chart here shows the local limits that were revised. And the key point that we want to take from this slide is some of the limits have been raised. And we'll talk a little bit more about why those limits were raised. Now, we also had local limits that were removed. Now, some of these limits that we had removed were effluent limits that were driven from technically based local limits. So we conducted sampling in our area to see what our industries were actually putting in our sewer. And that's how we found out that we could remove some of these limits. Now, removing these limits would reduce the monitoring burden that we're putting on industries as well as the city, because we require the businesses to sample on a regular basis to make sure that they're not doing anything that's going to harm the sewer. So what we did is we removed some of those limits because they weren't required by our permit anymore. Then we had local limits that were unchanged. There was no change for them, so we left them the same. So the ordinance that we have this evening is going to do several things. Some of the things that it's going to do is update the local limits. It's going to update definitions, because again, our last definitions were from 1999, and some things have changed. Our ordinance is also going to add enforcement authority for wastewater discharge violations. So there's a way to enforce if industries are violating the permits that they're given. We also added language to allow for wastewater discharge permit modification. So if a business is changed, we can modify their permit. We also removed affirmative defenses. Now, the ordinance had some language that basically allow for using bypass or excuses for allowing the discharge of non-pretreated wastewater. So we removed it because we want the industrial users to demonstrate and report any issues that they have at their facilities and not just use an excuse as to why they can't meet their permit. We also updated the public notification language that's required by the Code of Federal Regulation. When we have users in our service area that violate their permit, we're required to publish that in the local newspaper. So we updated the language to meet the regulations. So what we're asking this evening, we're requesting a reading of the title of the ordinance. We also are asking to waive the further readings and introduce a Camarillo Sanitary District ordinance amending the industrial waste supplement to the operations code. That concludes this presentation. If you have any questions, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
Thank you. I have a question. I'll start it off. So, thank you for the report first. So there's quite a red line version on all of this. It's pretty much, for the most part, been rewritten. In your opinion, have we touched all the important bases on this? Is there anything that we've left out, perhaps, that we should have put in? Or are you comfortable that this is where, our sand district needs to be?
Yes, there is a very extensive red line version. We had a consultant look at that extensively to do sampling in our service area, and I'm very comfortable that the limits are going to protect our wastewater infrastructure as well as the water reclamation facility.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Ms. Jennison?
Just a quick question, Darren. You talked about an enforcement authority added to this new ordinance for water discharge permit violations. What kind of protocols do we have in place to deal with the various industries which are discharging wastewater into the sanitation district?
So thank you. That's a very good question. And what we do is when we find out that a business is violating their permit through sampling that we have conducted, we can put them under an order that they have to do more stringent sampling. More stringent sampling would require them to spend more money, and a lot of times businesses don't want to do that. If they continue the violation, we can escalate that. In the ordinance, we even have it that it can be turned over to the authorities for prosecution as a discharger.
Just to follow up, is it self-reporting by these industries, or does city staff or contractors for the city follow up on doing the testing as well?
So we go out and actually sample their facilities. We set up samplers at the location and do the sampling. We send the samples off to our laboratories that we contract with, and we get the analysis back.
Thank you.
Any other question? Ms.
Yes.
Bravo Martinez?
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Carter, for your presentation. I just want to confirm the pollutants that were removed from the local limits. I just want to understand correctly. So those, it looks like removing them would not be a cause for concern, and they are not found in the current, they're not really found, right? That's not what we're seeing.
Yeah, that is correct. And what has happened is our permit, the state has removed those requirements for testing because it's something that's not there.
Okay.
So we didn't want to have a burden on the industries that they have to continue the sample for something that we know is not going to be present and not required. So we've removed and relaxed those.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Any other questions or anything? No? Okay, with this is an advertised public hearing. I'm going to open up the public hearing. I'm going to ask the public if anybody would like to speak on this particular issue. Seeing no one come forward, I'm going to close the public hearing. I'm going to ask directors, are there any further questions anybody needs to ask and or attempted and answered? Everybody all right with it? So with that, I'm going to request a reading of the title.
Yes, this is an ordinance of the Board of Directors of the Camarillo Sanitary District, amending the Industrial Waste Supplement to the Camarillo Sanitary District Operations Code. Thank you.
With that, I'll waive further reading and introduce the Camarillo Sanitary District Ordinance amending the Industrial Waste Supplement to the Operations Code. We'll need a second.
Second.
There is a motion and a second. Please vote. That passes 4-1 with one absence. Thank you very much. Okay, that gets down to oral communication. Anyone, we were able to go out to the sand plant today, and we saw the Tesla battery backup system, brand new, very exciting project. I think we're one of the first, if I believe, at least in this area, to do it. Batteries weigh a lot. Isn't that amazing how many tons that they weigh? Incredible. But it's a great project, and I want to thank staff for doing their due diligence on this. That was a lot of work, so that was really great. Anybody else have anything to say? No? Okay, so with that, thank you, everyone. We're adjourned.
And I will reconvene the meeting of the Camarillo City Council. Let the record reflect that all council members are present except for Mr. Tremblay. And we will go right into oral communications. Start with Mr. Tennyson.
Meetings attended on May 18th. I attended the Association of Water Agencies of Ventura County Breakfast Series. It was an interesting morning with two presenters bringing forth new technology for ocean water desalinization. Both of them are ocean-based, not land-based, which tends to be a problem with coastal commissions in California. One of them is under the water, 400 meters below the water, using the hydrology and the energy from the water itself to generate the power to desal. The other was a company that has made buoys in the ocean for years and years and years. It looks like it has potential. Both of these companies will be having early testing within the next 6 months, one of them up in near the Vandenberg Air Force Base. But it'll be interesting to see because they can create farms of these desals spread out 400 meters below the ocean, or some floating on top like buoys. And as Mr. Tremblay would say over and over again, water's an issue. It's not a local issue. It's a regional and a statewide issue. And this could be some technology that helps us use a sustainable source of water, our great oceans. So it was interesting to see. On the 23rd, and I forget what day that was, yesterday, Councilmember Kildee and I both attended the Investment Committee meeting and the Finance Committee meeting. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Meetings attended and events. May 11th, I attended Coffee with a Cup. May 11th, I attended the Ventura County Airports Authority meeting with Mayor Santangelo. May 15th, I attended the CSUCI Site Authority, of which I am an alternate on. May 17th, I attended the Utilities Committee meeting with Councilmember Tremblay. May 17th, I attended the Boys and Girls Club grand opening of their expansion, which was really a wonderful event, and it was great to see so many community members coming together for such a wonderful cause. May 18th, I attended the Economic Development Collaborative. May 19th, I went to the Pride for Camarillo event. It was a fundraiser event. It's to help support our LGBTQ plus community members in Camarillo and throughout, and they will be having a big family event on June 25th. May 21st, I attended the Rebozo Festival. It is a nonprofit. The event was at the Camarillo Ranch House, and over 800 people attended, and they really work to promote the rich heritage of our area and to highlight the rebozo, which is a shawl. And they also raise funds for a local nonprofit, so it was a great event to be at. On May 22nd, I attended a tour of the University Preparation Charter School at CSU Channel Islands. May 22nd, I attended a dinner and a speaker series with Anti-Defamation League CEO Jonathan Greenblatt, and this was at the University of California, Santa Barbara. It was a very informative speaker event, in spite of, unfortunately, the terrifying rates of hate crimes, the increase of hate crimes throughout our country. But at the same time, it was also a very hopeful and empowering event. May 23rd, I attended the Camarillo Healthcare Center flag celebration and reception with Councilmember Tremblay. And I really appreciated all of the support that the staff was giving each other. You could really see, how strong that organization is, and I'm very proud to have them here in our city of Camarillo. And yesterday, I want to end with this. Yesterday was the 9-year anniversary of the mass shooting that occurred in Isla Vista and at UCSB. I remember my little sister was at UCSB during that time, and it was just terrifying even to know. I remember that exact day when it happened, and we couldn't get a hold of her. And unfortunately, there were so many lives that were taken that day as well. And today is also the 1-year anniversary of the mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas, where 19 children and 2 teachers went to Robb Elementary and they never came back. Gun violence is the #1 cause of death for children. It's not cancer, it's not accidents, it's gun violence here in the United States. I send my love as these families grieve this unnecessary and preventable trauma. My heart is with these families and communities impacted by gun violence, not only in our community, but throughout the United States. And as a mother and your councilwoman, I will continue to advocate and support gun violence prevention and gun safety. Thank you.
Mr. Kilty.
Okay. Excuse me. On May 11th, I had a VCOG meeting. May 23rd, along with Councilmember Tennyson, I attended the Investment Committee and also the Finance Committee meeting. I did attend the re-grand opening of the Camarillo Boys and Girls Club, and what a facility. It's great. I know, thank Mr. Tennyson for all your hard work on that. I did attend the Coffee with a Cop. It was a lot of fun. My coffee was a little cold, though. Do you think they can warm it up a little bit next time for me? Do you think you might be able to do that? No, it was a really great event, and it's really great to see what they do for our city, and they're unsung, and we really appreciate all of them. Also attended Saturday, the Camarillo Ranch had that shredding event. And typical Kildy response, I got there at 12:30 and they were full. So if anybody knows of another shredding event available, please let me know. I've got 2 boxes that are ready to be shredded. I'll put them in our bedroom until then, and that'll please my wife amazingly too. So I need to get those shredded. But a really good event. I'm really, really happy that it was such well attended. It was really, really great. I've noticed a little bit uptick in our graffiti in the city. Not uncommon at the end of a school year, but let's all of us be due diligence, use the graffiti hotline, and see if we could address these as quickly as possible. And I too share your sentiments about gun violence. And my wife is a teacher, my sister is a teacher, and I've got several family members and friends that are teachers too. And the last thing that they should have to worry about is that particular situation on campus with all the other things that teachers have to go through now. So we're going to improve that some way, somehow. So with that, that's all I have tonight. Oh, one other thing, I want to thank Commander Tennyson for addressing that abandoned bicycle. I really appreciate that, and it's gone, and it's an improvement. So thank you again, and if you please pass that along to your employees that had something to do with that, I appreciate it. So that's all.
Thank you. Okay, for me, for meetings attended May 11th, I attended the Airport Authority along with Dr. Martinez Bravo. On May 17th, I attended the LAFCO meeting. On May 17th, I also attended Clean Power Alliance. On May 17th, also, I attended the Boys and Girls Club ribbon cutting, and that was a really great event. It was so fantastic to see so many people there, and it's just a really wonderful addition, and I'm so pleased to see them see that come to completion. On May 24th, which is today, I attended the ribbon cutting out at the Tesla battery at the wastewater plant, and then I had a CPA Finance Committee. And I would also like to echo and thank Dr. Martinez Bravo for her words about gun violence. I share your sentiments. And that takes care of meetings for me. Okay, this brings us down to our consent calendar, which are items B through O.
Madam Mayor, if I may, with the consent of my colleagues up here, I'd like to pull item M for further discussion. It's the Camarillo train station undercrossing.
Yeah, why don't we do the rest of the consent calendar, and then we'll take item M.
That'd be fine.
Okay,
Move approval.
I will second.
okay, we have a motion and a second. Please vote. That passes 4-1 with one absence. Okay, that brings us down to item M.
All right. Would you like Dave to do your staff report, or would you like me to go right into discussion?
Sure, I could give an introductory, brief report on this item. So before council tonight is the item to move forward with a couple agreements on this project and a little bit of history on the project. I'll go ahead and maybe cover some of the questions anticipated. The project has actually been in the city's capital improvement program since 2010. The initial need identified is pretty straightforward: to increase accessibility to both platforms. You're very familiar, there's two sets of tracks that come into Camarillo. On either side of Camarillo, it's a single track approaching the city from either direction. And then it goes double track approaching the station, and the platform is accessible, or both tracks are accessible by platforms on either side. To get from one side to the other is an existing pedestrian overcrossing that's in place starting on either side of the parking lot and up and over the tracks right next to the freeway overpass. So the initial, or the inception of the project came to be to, again, increase accessibility for train passengers to utilize either platform, either set of tracks. It's been a historical and continuing situation where the trains will use, it's not a set determined absolute that every train approaching is known on which platform it's going to be on. The different agencies, the train, Metrolink and Amtrak are the primary, or are the passenger rails that go through there, do their best at coordinating that. The other element that comes into play is the tracks are owned by Union Pacific Railroad. They are the lead on use of track. So the passenger rail also needs to be coordinated with freight traffic, freight trains. So anyway, where trains end up on which platform can vary, and there has been cases, and we do receive complaints of folks that thought they were going to be on one platform and really were supposed to be on another one. If they have enough time, they can make the pedestrian overcrossing. That's there now. But the idea was to enhance, again, the ability to utilize either platform in a more accessible fashion. That's where the inception of this undercrossing, pedestrian undercrossing tunnel came to be. Another element of improving and enhancing train scheduling and which tracks can be used by which carrier is double tracking is a very beneficial thing to do. Essentially extend the length that there are two tracks available, can give much more flexibility to the operation and timing and scheduling of trains to have one on a, so if you've ever been on the train before and you may stop on a siding and all of a sudden another train comes the other direction very fast. And so that's all part of scheduling train, the different users, freight and or passengers. So there's another element of that was born to move forward with the project to increase that accessibility, plus some double tracking. That's would be a very a big benefit, especially between Camarillo and Oxnard. So that was essentially the inception. Very, very early on, the original intent was to try to come up with what we call an at-grade pedestrian crossing, where you can just walk across the platform from one side to the other without right there. I believe the Moore Park station still has that in existence. Those are no longer approved. They're no longer allowed. So that took away that option, and so then we started the process of looking at what's it going to take to do an undercrossing, a pedestrian undercrossing. So it's been in the CIP for some time, and as we've gone forward, and as council has considered previous CIPs on identifying funding sources for that, definitely dependent on funding and looking for grant funding. A grant application was submitted and then approved. It was actually through LoSAN, the longer distance regional carrier, essentially Amtrak. There's a grant application submitted and then awarded for a very large project across the corridor, the LoSAN corridor, San Diego up to San Luis Obispo, for a bunch of different improvements. The undercrossing was a part of that application, along with double tracking in different locations, including between Oxnard and Camarillo. So the grant of Prop 1B monies and some other transit rail funding was awarded at that $6.89 million, and that was several years ago. And so that funding amount was identified with, at that time, and coming to council as we went through that, with a commitment for city matching funds of $910,000. So over the years, the project budget and has been updated. The cost is updated to where we are now, an estimated $15 million total. And also, a couple years ago, we did then take the step to get started on preliminary design, very rough preliminary design on where would this undercrossing likely go, what's the footprint, some of the identifying the major stakeholders included in the process. So council did award, and we do have an existing agreement with Rail Pros that has been pretty well completed, that preliminary design effort. And also along the way, City Council was very clear, and actually we restructured our project in our capital improvement program to identify that there was going to be some unfunded portion that was going to be reliant on additional grant funds. And with council's direction and assistance through VCTC, and city staff has coordinated with VCTC and LoSAN to make that point clear. And look at additional funding options to increase the amount of grant funding and minimize the amount of city funding that's going to be needed for this project. So fast forward to tonight, we've got the next step is to move forward with conceptual design and environmental review. And the timing on this is why it's before you tonight, and as mentioned in the staff report, to get going on that work now is there's another round of funding available that's been submitted for, as described in the staff report. It's the Solutions for Congested Corridors program funding availability that's been submitted by VCTC for an application of almost $8 million, $7.92 million. So that's been submitted, and we anticipate hearing back a decision on that that's going to be presented to the California Transportation Commission in late June, June 28th. It's anticipated that there's a tremendous amount of money available for this, and I feel it's very likely that that's going to be awarded. Upon award of that, the environmental review phase needs to be completed within 6 months. So it's an extensive amount of work that needs to get started. So that's what's before you tonight is another agreement with Rail Pros to mainly get started quickly on the environmental review process, so that can go in parallel with this funding then that is anticipated to receive to move forward. That additional funding will essentially fund the rest of the project. And not need really any more than that $910,000 original commitment of city matching funds to go forward. Our current CIP still does show some city funds in our traffic mitigation fund and other funding sources of city funds, but with these other grant monies, it would not require any additional city funding as far as the project is laid out and what we know at this point. So anyway, that's why we're here tonight, is for that agreement, along with a couple other things need to move forward. Again, like I mentioned, the stakeholders identified. Major one is Union Pacific, like I mentioned. They're actually going to be the permitting authority because they own the right-of-way. the tracks there. Union Pacific needs to review and permit this undercrossing. That's a lengthy process that we're going to get going on and need to enter into an agreement with Union Pacific for their review and administration of that. And then also working with Metrolink also has a regulatory authority position in the project also that needs their review. So there's another agreement for that to happen. So that's why we're before you tonight with this project. Like I said, that's already been in the CIP for some time, taking this steps forward. And that's my best attempt at briefly explaining.
May I start?
Go right ahead.
I have a couple questions first, Dave. So how does that, the intercity rail capital improvement funds, the low sand grant, I think we got, we were approved for $6.8 million. Is that upfront money, or do we submit, receipts and vouchers and, change orders and bills? I mean, how do we get compensated for that?
That'll be reimbursement based.
That's a reimbursement based. Okay, and the grant that, my understanding that VCTC has applied for, have they been awarded that yet?
Well, like I said, that's been applied for, and that's it. The process for that type of funding, it gets on a list that then gets recommended to the California Transportation Commission. The actual state Transportation Commission needs to act on that list. So that request has been submitted. The list has been submitted with this project identified for that $7.92 million. So it's been applied for, and based on that process and the availability of funds, it's expected that that's going to be awarded.
Okay. Okay, so if I may start, my comments and my statements may take a little bit. I'll try to go through them as quickly as I can. I think it's a very important issue here that needs to be discussed here. My comments are in no way disparaging staff or anybody else about this. I really appreciate all the hard work that staff. I am in receipt of one individual public comments on this particular item. I just want to go through kind of a timeline and a chronology of events here, and my own personal thoughts. I have had no discussion with any other council member on this at all. So I want to start. Obviously, the situation there can be improved. I'll be the first to stand up and say yes. This situation can be improved here. In any way, shape, or form, I don't want my comments to insinuate that it doesn't. What I have a problem with is that we were awarded a grant for about $6.8 million for a project that we neither lease nor do we own. We're asked to do about $910,000, about $1 million of that of upfront money there. We also are asked that we are going to the next Rail Pros Engineering. We've got a cost for that of about $302,000, $750,000 for other costs. Bottom line is that we're asked. It's going to be anywhere from about $1.5 million to $1.6 million money that we're asked to come from up front. Now, realistically, some of that could be come from the grant. Some of it could be reimbursed to us. I'll be the first to admit that. However, Union Pacific, we've got to make a deposit of $75,000 to them. Metrolink encroachment permit and contingencies, another $205,000. We don't even know if we're going to get the grant from VCTC. We hope that we can get the grant, but we don't know if we're going to. And the $15 million is an estimate on our best estimate that our engineers can give us, which I think we have tremendous engineers. However, with the inflation rate we're going on, it's probably not going to be able to be constructed at least for several years. That means 2 years or more. We really don't even know if the $15 million is going to be enough to adequately fund this. I did a little research about the ridership, and the nearest I can figure about ridership from the Metrolink. Now, these numbers are not completely accurate, and I totally understand that they've taken a really big hit with COVID, and the ridership for train has not come back yet. But as near as I can figure, we've got about 33 boardings per day of the Metrolink transit. Now, that doesn't include the Surfliner there. So let's just say that we can add another 30 to 40 people. Let's just say we have 100 people per day that are riding the train station in our particular geographic location of this train station. And we're talking about that we know of at least $15 million to build this, and that might be a little bit on the low side. Now, granted, we can amortize this over a number of years, but that's an awful lot of money for around, and I think I'm being relatively kind here, about 100 riders per day. Now, there's some history from this. I did a little research too, and my understanding is Rancho Cucamonga has got somewhat of a similar facility there. My understanding is that they have to close it at night, that there has been a public safety issue here about how we're going to protect the riders there and or the public that are there. And remember, I'm going to hearken back to this. We do not own that facility here. So is the city of Camarillo going to be on the hook for that for the extended future about the maintenance of this and or the security of this? And if so, what will the long-term costs of this be, of this here too? I mean, if it is approved and if it does go forward, my hope is at least we'll have cameras there so we can definitely have some safety there. Bottom line to all this, I appreciate what staff's done. I acknowledge that there is improvements that can be made. However, I do not feel that this is the right way to go about it. I think it's way more money, way too expensive for the amount of benefit that we've got here, and I am really concerned about the public safety issue of this. So with that, unless I can be persuaded by more dialogue here, this is a very large event and or project in our city. I think it has to be done right. It has to be reasonable what we could do. It has to be felt that it's going to be successful here. So I have some real issues and long-term problems with this particular project here. So I wanted to share that with my colleagues up here, and certainly would be open for any dialogue.
Mr. Tennyson.
I have not spoken with Councilmember Kildee. I did discuss this with Councilmember Martinez Bravo, but he must have read my mind. I crunched the numbers just a little bit more, and the numbers I come up with, even at the higher ridership pre-COVID, was about 92 passengers per day for both the Los End Metrolink and the Surfliner. I'm concerned about the amount of money we spend, and I know it's grant money, but being the fiscal conservative I am, grant money is taxpayer money. And so each of us pay for it. We all have a responsibility sitting up here on the dais to be responsible stewards for all taxpayers' money. I think this is an excessive amount of money to spend for something. I walked the ramp a couple times in the last few days, and I'm not young. I don't have any physical limitations yet, but I made it back and forth over the ramp in a short period of time. I have real concerns about public safety issues with the tunnel. And we can put cameras, and cameras are great after the fact. I think our police chief would attest that cameras do not prevent crime. You're building a tunnel underneath the railroad tracks that will be away from the prying eyes of the public mostly, and from law enforcement. They're driving the streets, the parking lots, they're not going to see down in the tunnels. And I would rather do something to prevent crime from happening to begin with versus using cameras and technology to catch an offender post-crime. I don't want to see victims. I can tell you that in the evening hours, I would be hesitant to walk in an underground tunnel. I don't care how well lit it is. I know that my wife would be uncomfortable doing this. I wouldn't want my daughter or my grandsons to do it. So I have concerns from a public safety standpoint. And I think that there's plenty of articles out there, and I'm sure Councilmember Martinez Bravo may share some of that information about problems with tunnels under railroad tracks or pedestrian tunnels going under roadways. And so I too am hesitant. I understand this is the design phase, and if I'm correct, the city's already spent $910,000, David?
No, not that total amount spent so far. If I can estimate, it's less than that. Yeah, somewhere in the range of 500,000, I would estimate. Again, that's a real.
And the city's total liability from the standpoint of the design phase is that $910,000. Is that correct?
Originally, yes. Now, what's changed is, and I didn't elaborate on that, but the grant money was specifically for construction.
Correct.
And now a recent change has been made to transfer 1.9 million of that to design. So that could cover these costs of what's proposed to go forward with tonight, that the city would not need to expend any more city funds at this point.
But at a future point, we may be asked to expend more funds?
That commitment of 910,000 was a part of that original grant application and award. We would have to dig in to see if there's a decision made by council other than moving forward on what implications or ramifications come about regarding that 910,000 commitment.
I guess I've made my point clear, and my request would be that we table this for some further discussion and more follow-up from staff and VCTC and information on what the entire projects may cost and what kind of funding we can expect, and if we're going to have any more liability, plus the safety issues being addressed.
Dr. Martinez Bravo.
Thank you. I'm struggling with this item. On the one hand, I do see the need to improve, the crossing and allow for access for everyone. But at the same time, when I saw tunnel and then doing some of the research on the history of tunnels, I did have some concerns regarding that. So I have two quick questions. Number one, the current walkway that is there, is that ADA compliant?
It's actually somewhat recent findings of no, it is not completely 100% ADA compliant.
Okay. Because it's pretty steep, so somebody who is elderly, I think, may have a hard time getting all the way up or down from where it's at. Correct?
Possibly, and I do understand that the non-compliance issues are relatively few and somewhat
Okay.
minor as far as slope and steepness and that kind of thing goes.
Okay.
But it is a relatively long up and down pathway.
Okay. And the second question that I had, and I think Councilmember Kildee brought it up as well, is the city of Camarillo would be responsible for all maintenance and I imagine for all public safety issues
So those
that would arise.
I'm sorry. Those details haven't been worked out yet. That would be something that would need to be spelled out in some fashion, whether it's a maintenance agreement with VCTC. Right now we do perform some limited maintenance at the parking lot area, the landscaping, the irrigation, trash removal, graffiti removal. But up on the platform and having to do with the signage and train-related things on the platform, the city does not handle any of that. It's, I guess, still to be determined what the details of that would be.
Sure.
There could likely be some type of agreement structured that would include, and likely it would be VCTC would be the next primary agency that is affected or would be a party, but it could be some type of an agreement of shared responsibilities and costs.
Okay. So as I started delving into some of the, research and even some of the social sciences research in terms of perceptions of tunnels and who utilizes them and who tends to avoid, I looked a little bit at the history in Los Angeles. And in LA, in the early 1900s, as the automobile industry was taking off, unfortunately, there were a lot of accidents that were occurring, and a lot of children were being injured or killed. And so the city decided to move forward with implementing the tunnels, or these underground tunnels, so that was like in the 1920s, 1930s, to a point where they were able to construct about 200. Over time, there were multiple issues that developed, one of them being that many families and children, they were kind of being isolated from these public spaces that they needed to get to. While they were, quote, safer, at the end, there was that issue. Over time as well, the trend has been to close tunnels and to fill them up with cement. And the main reason for that being a public safety issue. That is, unfortunately, people were utilizing tunnels for illicit drug use. People who were unhoused were being victimized, and that sort of thing. And in looking at just some of the social science research, I also found that, when you're estimating preferences and for the different types of pedestrian crossings, women and the elderly population were less likely to, or they had a higher aversion for these underground or, these tunnels. And I think a big part of that, or not I think, but that was a big part of the variable, was the safety portion of it. And so that is where I do struggle with this item, in addition to the financial piece of it. I do struggle with, is this a tunnel where I would be okay walking, where I would feel okay? And to tell you the truth, I would be worried about walking there, late at night, or, and so I guess my other question is, would this be something that would be open 24 hours? Or could we, in the design of it, can we implement some locking mechanisms where people won't have access? So I have all of those questions and concerns throughout.
Yeah, absolutely. In general, as we move forward with design, those are the elements that we're going to be exploring further and really figuring out what is the maximum mitigation to any of those risks could be. Most everything, or a lot of has already been mentioned with lighting and cameras. There are existing cameras out there at the Metrolink station that are operational, and along with the possibility of the gating, and whether it's remote actuated, automatic actuated on timers, or physically locked and unlocked and that type of thing. Those are all elements that would be part of the next step on moving forward with design to identify those things. Mm-hmm. We'd be coming back to council if it moves forward at those points to review the recommendations for those items, and with a project of this significance and with those kind of risks that would need to be mitigated, we'd be wanting to come back to council to review those before finalizing things.
Okay, thank you. Those are my thoughts.
Do you have more thoughts? Or no?
I have a couple comments later, but please
Okay.
proceed.
I'm struggling as well. You took the words right out of my mouth. I looked at this originally as a way to increase access, and if we're worried about ridership levels, perhaps making it more accessible would help with ridership. I'm not sure if that really plays out. I'm not sure. I am concerned about an underground tunnel at night. I worry about public safety, and I'm also worried about the financial implications for something that we don't own. So I share all the concerns that have been brought up here tonight. And that's where I'm going to leave my comments for now. Mr. Kildee?
I have another comment. I think, listening to my colleagues here, I think it's very important for us to remember, we do not lease this property, nor do we own this property here. It is VCTC. If VCTC thinks that this is something that really needs to be done, they're the ones that should, in my opinion, my humble opinion here, they're the ones that should go forward with this. I'm only speaking as one council member. But if we have this tunnel down there, and if there's one public safety issue down there, I would feel horrible. And I had to tell you, too, that if, in fact, heaven forbid, there is a lawsuit there, they're not going to stop with VCTC. They're going to look at the city of Camarillo about this. And that's my concern with this. So I've had the benefit of talking about this for quite a while here, and I totally am understanding of others' thoughts here. But I just don't see how this is going to work for the amount of money that's being spent and the benefit. And the bottom line to this, is it really needed? Do we really need to do this? And for me, I'm not convinced that we do. Those are my thoughts.
Madam Mayor, if I could, I'd make the same suggestion I made earlier. Let's table this, and out of deference to our missing council member who sits on VCTC and may be able to give us additional information, I'd ask we table it to the next council meeting or one shortly thereafter.
May I make a comment on that? I don't necessarily disagree with it. From my understanding, we are under certain restrictions that we do have to do to the grant, and I don't know what those timelines are.
Yeah, in general, the timeline is end of June, beginning of July is when that additional funding would be awarded. And then within 6 months, the environmental review is supposed to be completed, which is a challenge in itself for that timing. Hence, the staff's bringing this forward now to get going on that and to get a little bit of a jump on that environmental review process. So that's the timing constraints that is under for that additional funding.
So if I'm hearing, is there enough time if we decide to perhaps a future meeting in the not-too-distant future?
Yeah, again, to a black and white yes or no is hard to give at this time. With those funding constraints, there sometimes is the opportunity to request extensions or a little bit more time. It's just, we don't know. But what we do know with this funding source is, as opposed to some others where you have 3 years to move forward and complete items that are under the grant funding, this definitely has a step that has to be completed soon. That's the nature of this funding, is set up for projects that are ready to go and move forward. So again, by delaying, we'll just put a tighter constraint on that timing that could cause issues with that funding source in the future.
Okay, I just want to have one quick comment, and that's it. My comments are in no way to disparage VCTC in any way, shape, or form. I think they do a very good job for what they do. Those are just my personal comments.
Was that a motion?
To table until the next meeting.
Okay. I will second that.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Any comments or questions on that?
And you're, just for correction, you're tabling for the next meeting?
Yes.
Yes.
Will that work?
I'm not sure that'll work, but we'll take a look at that. Yeah, if not, the meeting after that, that'll, just the way it'll
Okay.
be.
Okay.
Are we tabling it for a future, non-specific date then? Okay.
Okay, that'll be the motion. Then please vote. And that passes 4-1 with 1 absence. Okay, well, look at that. That brings us exactly to 6 p.m., which is our time for general public comment. So this is time for comments for items not on the agenda. Do we have anyone who would like to speak? Are there any comment cards? Okay, that ends our public comments. So this will bring us to item P, which is our Transportation Integration and Efficiency Study presentation. I believe it's Sean Cross.
Good evening, Mayor Santangelo and council members. Just a real quick, brief introduction. We have Claire Grasty, the Transit Director with the Ventura County Transportation Commission, here to present on the Transit Integration and Efficiency Study. Thank you.
I guess right on cue, someone from VCTC is here. I'll just say we'd be happy to work with the city regarding your concerns and providing more information where appropriate on our end. So again, I'm Claire Grasty. I'm the Director of Public Transit. I'm going to go through a presentation on the Transit Integration and Efficiency Study, or TIES, as we call it. So why we're doing this study. It was initiated by the Commission in the summer of 2020 due to the impact COVID-19 had on transit. The pandemic also underscored issues of race and equity nationwide, as well as the challenges that essential workers have getting places. Additionally, beyond that, ridership had been falling on transit prior to the pandemic. So because of that, we conducted this study. Since then, challenges have only increased: inflation, escalating cost, fewer contractor bids, increased congestion, things of that nature. A little bit of background. We had conducted VCTC a similar study that concluded in 2012. Some changes that followed were the formation of the Gold Coast Transit District, as well as the East County Transit Alliance that provides direct dial-a-ride service between the cities. This study began in 2021. It has examined data for all transit operators in Ventura County. We've held now more than 6 operator working group sessions, interviewed commissioners, interviewed city and staff city managers. We collaborated with our recently completed coordinated services plan that had some overlap with this, and conducted focus group outreach. So the question we're really trying to answer here is, can integration improve transit service and the rider experience in Ventura County? So what are the main issues? So there are 9 different transit operators in Ventura County. And while that can be great for local service, you can provide good, responsive local service within cities, providing regional service can be very difficult. And getting around if you don't have a car or unable to drive can be very difficult. And regional trips have only increased over time for commute reasons, for medical reasons, and for other reasons. Beyond that, there have been, as I mentioned, increased expensive and less competitive contracts, but driver retention and the competition between all the operators for those transit operators, employees, has become more of an issue, and then local priorities have changed over time. Additionally, because there are so many different operators, there's a wide variation in policies and fares, programs, and information available. So the approaches we've looked at are in communication, coordination, collaboration, and consolidation, leaning mostly towards collaboration. Some recommended actions and strategies that have come through this is improve financial resilience by coordinating administrative functions, centralizing demand response call taking and scheduling, aligning rider policies, fares, and eligibility, standardizing, surveying, marketing, and online presence. So there are 3 alternatives that I will go through that have come out of the study. They range from mostly collaborative to partial consolidation to full consolidation. Of course, other variations are possible, but these alternatives provide a framework for stakeholders to respond to and adapt moving forward. So the alternative one is sub-regional consolidation of demand response service, and then increased formalized interagency coordination. So including fixed route service planning, procurements, policies, and marketing.
Alternative 2 creates a countywide demand response agency, so it would provide, one paratransit agency throughout the whole county, including dial-a-ride programs as well. It probably would initially be housed within another agency. Also includes sub-regional consolidation of fixed route services, so Gold Coast Transit, Ojai, the Valley Express, and the Heritage Valley, and VCTC would all be one agency, and then Thousand Oaks, Canaan Shuttle, Moore Park, Simi Valley, and Camarillo in another agency. These three agencies would simplify coordination, focus staff on transit, and sub-regional responsiveness. VCTC would continue to remain as the Regional Transportation Planning Agency and would transfer all of bus operations to Gold Coast. Alternative 3 is full consolidation. All operators would be in one agency. It is assumed to be Gold Coast Transit. It doesn't have to be, but for the purposes of the study, it is easiest to assume that as they are legislatively able to accommodate more members. If that were to be the case, their board would need to adjust to accommodate those members. All the operating bases that exist currently would continue to remain as we have a large county and would still need them. So comparison between them, I know this chart is small, but alternative 1, it requires an action plan and a voluntary commitment to these improvements. Alternative 2 balances risk by relying on the existing partnerships that are already well formed. Alternative 3 is ambitious with the greatest ability for improvement, but also the most difficult to execute. Alternative 1 has the least benefit for cost efficiency, but it protects all of the city's revenues for streets and roads that is currently being used. Alternative 2 is more expensive, at least initially, because there will be creation of new agencies and would likely take some time to realize those cost efficiencies. It would also allow those counties not joining Gold Coast Transit to continue to use funding for streets and roads for those cities that currently use it. Alternative 3 has the greatest potential for administrative cost efficiency, but all of those funds that are being used from streets and roads would have a negative impact for the cities that use it, though that would increase transit service through the district. So we see the ties as a roadmap for the future, defines these issues and practical strategies to improve transit. The alternatives provide a roadmap on how to implement these strategies. And alternative 1 codifies the actions that are already mostly agreed upon and sets the stage for integration. Some concerns that we have heard throughout the process, so related to funding, concerns that full or partial consolidation wouldn't result in better cost efficiency. Of course, the concerns of loss of streets and roads funding for the cities that use it, including Camarillo, and then uncertainty about the outcomes and how that will ultimately pan out. In terms of responding to community needs, so as I mentioned, local agencies are able to respond pretty well to their community's needs. And in the case of, we have the Camarillo dial-a-ride service here, there's a number of others throughout the county, but it is assumed that any sort of regional operator would continue to operate these types of services, and they do in many other cases. Other comments we've heard is really this do no harm sentiment. No one wants to see any service reduced in their area, and they wouldn't want to see it as a result of, less performing routes in certain areas. This study certainly does not recommend anything of the sort, and it would be up to the resulting agency to determine a service planning, document. But it would certainly that agency would certainly have to benefit the different needs throughout the county for more urbanized areas and more rural areas. So that's certainly an issue that we heard and we understand. So the next steps is soliciting public input, presenting to the agencies that we're doing tonight. We will be soon conducting a short-range transit plan, which will include strategies that come out of the ties and how to implement them. And then some future steps is collaborating with represented groups and then beginning to implement low-hanging fruit actions that are already basically agreed upon by the operators, and then develop working groups to really iron out the details related to finance, as well as operations, and then getting legal counsel involved in order to proceed based on the adopted alternative, which would come back to the commission in the next couple months. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Mr. Tennyson.
I'm going to just ask real quickly, with alternate 3, it looks like complete abdication of local control and local governance. What would the governing body look like under alternate 3?
So in this scenario that we are assuming for study purposes, it would be a Gold Coast Transit Board, which would have, right now they have 1 member per agency. So the assumption is that they would have, for every other city, they would have 1 member. So a little bit different than the VCTC board that has 5 supervisors plus all the city members. It would be assumed to continue to have 1 supervisor and 1 member from each city.
And with alternate 3, again, we lose the ability to use the TDA funds for local road work. We could potentially, with a governing board that size in Camarillo having 1 voice instead of 5 voices, lose the local control and the local coordination for our own needs, which are created for the people in the city of Camarillo, correct?
That's correct.
Well, I'll just go on record really quickly and say number 2 and 3 are non-starters with me.
Comments? Mr. Kildee, yeah.
I understand having a regional system, and there obviously can be a lot of improvements on that. I totally understand that. But if you look at our city, that we're not the biggest, but we're not the smallest on that, how do those other ones, like 2 and 3, impact us? In other words, we have a tendency a little bit to get swallowed up on this situation here, and how would that be counteracted?
So in this, alternative 2, I think is most likely, significantly more likely than alternative 3 coming into fruition. There's a lot more agreement upon alternatives 1 and 2, and I think at this point, alternative 3 is fairly unlikely. So for those purposes, the assumption, and of course, if Camarillo wanted to go to Gold Coast Transit, that would be an option as well. But the study assumes that the cities of Moore Park, Thousand Oaks, Camarillo, and Simi Valley would join together. And most of these cities are in similar situations. But with the exception of Simi Valley, all spend money on streets and roads still. All do work together as part of the East County Transit Alliance. It's assumed that it would be more like a joint powers authority structure. I think with, having only a few members as part of it, I mean, the county would be included as well. I think that would give a little bit more voice to all of the cities. I think, they already work, quite well together. Whereas if you were to join an agency that you're less familiar with, don't already have those types of relationships, have to give up all of your money for streets and roads, I think that would be a bit more complicated. But I think in the East County, there's a bit there's more similarities that, there's microtransit in Moore Park, and then there's the dial-a-ride service here. So there's more similarities that I think would support the type of needs that each of those cities have. And I think, having a smaller group with each having 1 voice would kind of lend itself to getting the types of, service needs that you want, enacted.
I'll just make a quick comment, and having been in this to a certain extent, there's no question that the system could be improved. My opinion only, number 3 is a total non-starter for me. This leaves us with 1 or 2. My preference as of right now is 1. I think nobody knows local more than local does, and I think we need to make sure that we have a relatively large seat at that table and decide how we're going to spend our limited amount of funds and where it's going to go. And that does not mean that we cannot partner with somebody else or get some levels of cooperation and cost-saving measures. I think in this, as we all know, that public transportation is heavily subsidized here. And there's no question that we need to work together to see how we can distribute more equitably our limited amount of funds. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you.
I will echo what was said. I think I do have some concern over how the integration will actually help improve transportation for our local residents. And I don't want local control to be taken from us, given our smaller population as well in comparison to other cities. And some of the concerns that you had up there, I have some of those concerns as well. And just so I understand that correctly, what you had up there were concerns that you had from surveying the community already, or that's just what you?
No, from the cities, the operators, from the transit operators and cities.
Okay, all right. Well, yeah, I won't repeat myself, but yes, I would have a hard time with those suggestions.
I have a question. Is this going to be a decision reached by VCTC? And if so, what happens to the cities that don't agree with the decision?
I think that's why it's taken us so long to get here to begin with. I think that is quite likely a possibility that it will not be a unanimous decision. I think it would be great if it is, and we're working as hard as possible to ultimately get to that. I think that's why we really think of this as a roadmap for the future, something that is done incrementally. Even if there was a strong desire for alternative 3, which there is not, we would still need to do that in an incremental process. I mean, there's a number of different contracts that end at different dates, and you couldn't just rip a Band-Aid off and all of a sudden all be one agency. So I think even more reason why this needs to be a roadmap to be done in an incremental way. I think there is, strong desires on part of our commission to implement Alternative 2, and there's desire to implement Alternative 1. I think even if Alternative 2 was in the majority, we would still need to start at Alternative 1 to eventually get to Alternative 2. And I think in that time, if that was the desire to get to Alternative 2, that we could, work through all of these issues that still have to be defined. I'd say finance in particular. The city finances are complicated because they're in some cities mixed with other types of funds, or these transit funds fund multiple people or parts of people, and detangling that is quite complicated. And so some of those things still need to be addressed, which is, a great concern that many people have had, is that we don't know exactly what the funding outcome would look like through something like this. So that's why, those working groups are still necessary. Even if Alternative 2 or 3 were to be picked, we still need to take those steps to do them. Maybe less necessary if we, started at Alternative 1 and stayed there. But I think ultimately that is, the best way where we can accommodate everyone's, desires if they end up being, different from each other, is doing this in an incremental and thoughtful way.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
More for Rachel. From a legal stance, just so I have clarity on this, the city of Camarillo does not have to be forced to integrate with VCTC?
I don't know the structure enough but I can't imagine we'd be forced to join something we don't want to join.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Madam Mayor, I'm just not sure your question was answered. I think you asked if VCTC can make this decision unilaterally without the city, and I'm not sure I heard a real response to that.
So the VCTC board will take an action. Does I'm not sure if the cities have to, but VCTC doesn't have an enforcement, there's nothing we can really enforce. We're really trying to get buy-in and doing what we can to try and get, a unanimous vote. And really, that's what we want. We want the cities to want to participate, but VCTC cannot enforce any city, really to do anything. And we wouldn't expect to. But, our commission will take an action on it.
Thank you. Now you've answered the question.
Thank you.
Your Honor, can I make this one? I want to thank VCTC for doing the study. Thank you very much for doing that.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay,
All right. Thank you for having me.
that's good. Thank you very much. Was there action required on this item?
It appears you're just looking for your comments
Yeah,
that you
they're-
provided.
Mayor, they're just looking for your feedback at this time, but I would entertain direction from the council if the city attorney would concur, if you would like us to memorialize your thoughts from tonight's discussion and send that in a letter form to the board at
I
BCTC.
think that'd be a great idea. Yeah. Thank you. All right. I should ask, are there any public comments on this agenda item? No one coming forward, okay. All right, so that will move us on to item Q. Sean again.
Good evening. I'll give the PowerPoint presentation a second. There we go. So again, good evening. Tonight I'm presenting the city's zero-emission bus rollout plan as drafted in compliance with the California Air Resources Board Innovative Clean Transit Regulation. The Transportation and Infrastructure Committee received an initial presentation on April 19th, and their questions and suggestions guided what is being provided tonight. Tonight's presentation will include an overview of regulations that will impact Camarillo Area Transit, or CAT, discussions of the CAT fleet, the types of zero-emission technology that is available to select from, the question about available electricity for zero-emission vehicles, the site selection of vehicle charging and storage, and then looking at comparative cost for the transition going through fiscal year 3031. And then finally, the staff recommendation. So the CARB Innovative Clean Transit, or ICT regulation became effective October 1st of 2019, and it requires that all public transit agencies with the buses who have a gross vehicle weight rating of 14,000 pounds or greater transition their bus fleets to zero-emission technologies. The deadline to have a 100% zero-emission fleet is 2040, and ICT impacts 10 of the city's current fleet of 18 vehicles. However, a proposed right-sizing of our current transit fleet would reduce that number from 10 to 4. Just real brief, the ICT classifies Camarillo as a small transit agency, and what that does is it essentially impacts our transition plan. In addition to the requirement to procure zero-emission buses, the regulation requires that a rollout plan be prepared and submitted to CARB by July 1st of 2023. And the rollout plan is a living document and is meant to guide the deployment of zero-emission bus fleets and help transit agencies work through many of the potential challenges and explore solutions. The rollout plan is required to include several items, including identification of zero-emission bus technologies planned for deployment, infrastructure required for the zero-emission fleet, a schedule of zero-emission and conventional internal combustion engine, or ICE, bus purchases and lease options, the schedule for converting the ICE buses to zero-emission buses, a description of how the transit agency plans to deploy zero-emission buses in disadvantaged communities, if that's applicable, and then a training plan and schedule for zero-emission bus operators and maintenance and repair staff, as well as identification of potential funding sources. Now, there are a couple of other CARB regulations that are also impacting CAT. And so while ICT impacts 14,000 pounds or heavier, there is the Advanced Clean Fleet regulation, and this was approved on April 27th of 2023, and noted that transit agencies that are subject to the ICT regulation did not have to begin converting their smaller weight vehicles until 2030, and smaller weight is 8,500 pounds to 14,000 pounds. I'll note that our proposed ZEB plan rollout does show or include these smaller weight vehicles being converted before 2030. We also have the Advanced Clean Car 2 regulation, which is in effect and impacts CAT's other lightweight transit vehicles that weigh less than 8,500 pounds, and that's essentially our minivans. This regulates the overall percentage of ICE vehicles that can be sold in the state, and we're anticipating that by 2035, ICE vehicles will not be expected to be available in California, and so that's how this particular regulation would impact CAT. The next couple slides are just a quick visual aid of what type of vehicles we're talking about. We have our passenger van, which in general weighs between 8,500 pounds and 14,000 pounds. The one that we currently have is a little over 10,000 pounds, and again, this one falls under the Advanced Clean Fleet regulation. We have our shuttle buses, also referred to as cutaway vehicles or cutaway buses, and those are over 14,000 pounds, regulated by the ICT. Our fleet range of these vehicle types range from 14,200 pounds to a little over 19,000 pounds. This shows a style vehicle that weighs over or under 6,000 pounds or under 8,500 pounds, and the minivans that we have are just over 6,000 pounds. And then the last vehicle we have here is a trolley bus. We don't currently have a trolley bus, but the fiscal year 23-24 budget includes funding to procure one so that we can return the trolley to our actual trolley route. And this vehicle will fall under ICT for that regulation, and so we account for that in the ZEB plan. Right. I'll note that this slide has a lot of information on it. There will be a summary page right after this one. But this specific slide looks at each of the city's current transit fleet, details of what the type of vehicle is proposed to replace it, and any changes to the applicable regulation and useful life of that change. So for instance, we have vehicle 820 that is a current shuttle bus, currently weighs 14,200 pounds, so it would fall under ICT. Between now and 2024 or 2025, we plan to procure a passenger van to replace that vehicle. Passenger van is a lighter weight vehicle and will fall under the Advanced Clean Fleet regulation. And this just is another slide, or this section just references the useful life of these particular vehicles. So this slide provides another view of the city's current fleet and the right-sized fleet. So we currently have 18 vehicles, the majority of which are planned for replacement between now and 2025. It will be this right-sized fleet, which will become the fleet that is transitioned to a zero-emission fleet as they become eligible for replacement. So now there are two technology types that meet CARB's requirements for zero emissions, hydrogen fuel cell and battery electric. Of the two technologies, hydrogen is more beneficial for transit agencies that have long-range mileage requirements, as electric vehicles have a more limited mileage range. Hydrogen vehicles can also be refueled faster than battery vehicles, potentially within 10 minutes, compared to several hours needed for battery vehicles. However, the availability of hydrogen vehicles is more limited than battery vehicles, which is a more mature market. And hydrogen technology is also more expensive than battery technology currently. Staff did a recent survey of transit agencies in Ventura County concerning their selection of zero-emission technology. Gold Coast Transit and Ventura County Transportation Commission have selected hydrogen fuel cell technology for their respective fleets. Battery electric technology has been selected by a number of other transit agencies in Ventura County. And it's the battery electric vehicles and infrastructure that's recommended for CAT's fleet. Now, there are concerns about the current electric grid and whether it will be able to handle the increased demand for electricity as vehicles are converted from fossil fuel to zero emissions. We asked Wildan, our contracted consultant who developed this plan for us, about these concerns, and they noted that utilities like SCE are planning for transportation electrification. Now, there are some utilities statewide that do have constraints and require additional time over the next couple of years to build up their infrastructure and increase capacity. I'll note that for CAT's fleet, our plan would be to charge these vehicles overnight, like late night into the early morning hours, when it would be during off-peak hours and likely not subject to the flex alerts or concerns about capacity. As part of this study, we also did meet with Southern California Edison about the proposed sites, and they did confirm that at least at those two locations, they did have current capacity available to provide the supply of the expected electricity demand. So this sheet shows our planned right-sized fleet that we're working on procuring between now and 2025. I'll note that the 2020 model year bus that's shown here is our current shuttle bus, number 833, which will not reach the end of its useful life until 2027. So this shows that the year that the vehicle will be ready for replacement, the applicable CARB regulation, the year that the new vehicle procurements must be zero emissions, and the year that the rollout plan proposes to purchase a zero emission vehicle. As you can see, we are planning to electrify a number of our fleet before the actual required date, so a little bit ahead of schedule, with the minivans actually with this plan being converted to zero emission about 8 years ahead of the 2035 date where we expect the vehicles not to be available for ICE-style or combustible engines. And this does anticipate, again, all of our 18 vehicles being zero emissions by 2031. I'll talk real briefly about the proposed sites that we looked at. We evaluated two main sites, a city-owned parcel located at the south side of Ventura Boulevard, just east of Springville, and the Camarillo Metrolink Station parking lot. First, we have Concept 1, which is the vacant lot depicted here in the blue triangle. This is a close-up of just a really preliminary site plan for the location. We would propose to only use the west end of the parcel, which would allow the other half to be separated and used for other purposes. The layout details the location of charging for the city fleet, as well as space for 5 electric VCTC over-the-road coaches that they are receiving from SB CAG, that they're attempting to find a location to charge in this area. This is a very preliminary cost of Concept 1, so a little over $6 million. The pros of the site is that it's a vacant land that allows for flexibility for design and has room to grow. However, the cost is higher than the Metrolink station site, and there are potential issues such as zoning and the process that would be needed to use the parcel as it is or was a part of redevelopment land and would require approval to be used for a different purpose than originally intended. So Concept 2 is the Metrolink station, again depicted here in the blue rectangle, and this is it's the Metrolink station parking lot off of Dawson Drive. And I'll note that our current contractor, Roadrunner, is currently at this site here and is where our current fleet is housed and maintained. So it is much closer to our current contractor. Again, a site layout design. It has space for our 18 vehicles to be stored and charged, and enough space for 5 over-the-road coaches from VCTC to also be charged. Preliminary analysis or cost estimate of this site, so a little under $4 million. Again, pros of the site is that it's closer to Roadrunner's facility, has a lower cost compared to the vacant land. It also falls within the zoning for the area. This site is owned by VCTC and would require a lease agreement with them. This is actually of the two sites, this is a site that they would prefer as well, so they're certainly amenable to a lease agreement for the site. And again, for both of these costs, It doesn't account for potential grants or the SCE Charge Ready program, or even a discussion with VCTC about cost sharing for either site. So again, so there is potential for additional funding to reduce the cost to Camarillo. So overall, staff's recommendation is for concept 2, again, for the items that we kind of previously listed. Again, we close to our current contractor, and VCTC is also would prefer this site. So I'm going to talk a little bit about replacement costs going through, or costs projected through 3031. As this was a request from the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. So these next 2 slides show the estimated cost of vehicle procurements and charging infrastructure and how they could be funded without the use of grant contributions, participation in the SCE Charge Ready program, or contributions from VCTC. Regardless of CARB regulations, Camarillo would still be looking at replacing 35 vehicles during this time period, so going through 3031. Consequently, the local contribution of ICE vehicles is attributed to transit TDA funds and not counted against TDA money diverted from streets funding. 80% of vehicle purchase cost is assumed to be covered by FTA funds that we receive as part of our annual allocation. $750,000 of TDA transit funds would cover the 20% local match associated with ICE vehicles. In this slide, it's assumed that TDA money would be used for infrastructure improvements, and that is all counted as diversion from streets funding to transit. The local match used for procurement of the 18 zero-emission buses or vehicles is also part of the nearly $4 million of TDA streets money that's shown diverted to transit. Again, what this table shows is a projection of close to $4 million of TDA funds between fiscal year 23-24 and fiscal year 30-31, and is being used, or that would be used for transit that would normally go to streets. The inference being here that that's nearly $4 million of general fund money that could be used to fund streets projects during this time period, assuming that the $4 million is needed. So it's sort of like we're attempting to show how this may impact the general fund, given how transit and streets and roads are funded. Now, this slide looks at the minimum requirements, so essentially adhering to the ICT regulation for the same time period, where we would be looking at the procurement of 3 zero-emission vehicles. And what this shows is that essentially the minimum requirements, or what we're proposing versus the minimum requirements, is it's about $938,000 more expensive. However, when you take into account that 80% of that cost increase is covered by FTA funding, the overall net impact to the TDA streets is a little under $200,000. So full fleet electrification would be delayed from being achieved in fiscal year 3031 to fiscal year 35-36. But the city will or would still be in compliance with all of the CARB regulations. So now I'll come into the recommendation, which was staff is to adopt the resolution approving the zero-emission bus rollout plan. As my understanding that I believe Vice Mayor Tremblay did submit a proposed or a suggested recommendation change or an additional paragraph to the rollout plan that the mayor and city council may have. So I'll leave that to how that wants to be introduced. But again, I'm available for questions. I want to thank you for your time. We do have Taylor Briglio with Wildan here, as well as Lydia Salas, our Public Works Management Assistant, and Dominic Perez, General Manager with Roadrunner. This was a team effort on developing this, so I also want to thank them for all of their work. Thank you.
Thank you for your report. Do we have questions? Mr. Kildee.
Question. Okay. How many total vehicles do we have here?
We own 18. We have 18.
We own 18. And we figure it's going to be $7.3 million maybe. Am I right on that? And then another I think 3.9 million for the charging and storage facility.
Let's see.
What's the math tell you on that? In other words, is it about preliminary cost estimates are
Right.
7.3 million, plus
So
what
we
we got to buy
Right,
the
so we have-
3.9 for the storage facility, right?
Correct. So we have, for vehicles, about 7 million, when you're looking at just the zero-emission vehicles. I mean, the slide that we do have up that considers the ICE and the ZEB, we're actually looking for the zero-emission vehicles, we're looking at about 3.4 million for those 18 vehicles being procured.
Okay, so my math tells me that, now some of the vehicles obviously are going to be more expensive than not, but my math tells me that's going to average anywhere from 450,000 to 500,000 per vehicle. Is that about right?
I'm certainly going blank on that. I think I'm going to have Taylor run up here real quick.
Can you clarify, you're saying 400,000, is that you're talking about for a specific vehicle purchase? It varies by vehicle type. And also these numbers are before any incentives are applied that really help bring down that upfront cost. We're showing you sort of worst case top line numbers, just to clarify that. I think some of your electric, are you including the infrastructure cost? Are you spreading that amongst the fleet? Because otherwise your numbers are a little high. The cost for an electric shuttle bus, which is your most expensive vehicle, is like around 250, maybe 300K for an electric shuttle bus. I think the trolley, which is a one-off, might be 455, but that's one of the 18. And then your passenger vans are maybe closer to 100. That's just the cost of the vehicle.
Okay. I'm a little startled. I remember we used to buy a house for that much. Okay, be that as it may. So let's just say we're under the gun, and I believe in electrification, believe me, I really do. So we have to go electric by, what's the date again on this?
So it varies. So with regards to the ICT, the regulation is that starting in between 2026 and 2028, as we buy new vehicles, 25% of those vehicles that are procured at a time have to be zero emission.
And what was the date on that again?
Starting in 2026 through 2028, when you get to, and I'll mention too that what that is when you order the vehicle. So if you order the vehicle in 2025, it could still be an ICE vehicle, even if you don't take possession of it until 2026. Now, beginning in 2029, all new shuttle or like vehicles of 14,000 pounds or greater have to be zero emission. And then by 2040, the 14,000 pound vehicles that are in service for a transit fleet by 2040, those all have to be zero emission. So the idea is they're attempting to stagger procurement of these vehicles so that you're not put in a position where in 2040 you have to take off an ICE vehicle before it's reached the end of its useful life.
Okay, so how long does an electric vehicle that's used, what's the lifespan of that?
So it can vary by vehicle. For the purposes of our ZEB plan, we picked the FTA guidelines on useful life. So for our shuttle-style vehicles, FTA guidelines is 7 years. Now, whether those vehicles, when they get into production, as even with our current ICE vehicles, if we find that they're holding up well, if they're being maintained well, if they're not, there's too much wear and tear, you can get additional years. It's not that you have to replace them at 7 years, but we use the useful life guidelines of FTA because our vehicles are majority purchased with FTA funds.
Okay, so I don't mean to monopolize the time again, but I think this is important. Are we looking at sources of funding? Because I'm thinking 7 years now, because they're already at 400,000 in 2023, so let's let's see, 2030, they're probably going to be up to maybe 600,000 per vehicle. So how do we afford to do this? And my second, is LNG part of this equation at all? It's not part of this at all.
So with regards to the funding, so I looked at the initially the basic funding, like we get TDA and we get our FTA allocation, and the sort of essentially you can get an annual allocation, you can start to set that money aside because you can hold on to it for several years. It doesn't account for, I mean, we do see every few years the congestion mitigation and air quality grants that come up that we can submit for that covers 88.53 or 47% of the cost and has like an 11.47% match. There are also other grants or funding opportunities for zero-emission vehicles, which as part of the ZEB rollout plan, we did provide like a list of grant options. I'm going to quickly defer to Taylor if
Sure,
he
yeah.
wants to
I can-
highlight a few.
Yeah,
Or
so there's a few gimmies off of the bat. HVIP, which is a voucher program run by the state, it's been in effect for years now, reduces the cost of the electric vehicle at the point of purchase. We can't use them for ICE vehicles, so that will probably knock, I think right now, I think it's like it varies by vehicle, about $60,000, maybe $80,000 for the shuttle buses. You also got for even at your small level, the minivans, we do expect next year to be able to claim Inflation Reduction Act tax credits as direct payments to public agencies, so that'll knock $7,500 off. The IRA may also stack on HVIP for another $40K on the shuttle buses, so you knock $100,000 off of that, you're much lower than the cost of an ICE vehicle at that point. We've also, Sean mentioned, working with SCE, they provide a lot of rebates towards the chargers and the infrastructure. Those were not accounted for in those top line infrastructure numbers. Again, we're showing sort of worst case scenario. Carl Moyer is another funding source that we can look at. That's, again, through the state. I think we listed like probably 15, 20 different options in the rollout plan, all that vary based on, some are competitive, some are rebates, some are formula funds. But there's a lot of money out there to help mitigate these upfront costs.
What about replacement cost? Has that even been discussed? I know that's 5 to 7 years in advance. Who is on the hook for that?
I mean, that's just your normal operations at that point, mostly FTA funds, probably. Not in this rollout plan, but we are working on a separate implementation plan that does look at vehicle replacements through 2040 and what your expected operating and capital and operating costs would be per year, accounting for inflation over time as well. Again, I think FTA is likely going to be your biggest source of funding for those replacement costs, and then you can cobble these other sources together for that 20% match funding if you want to go beyond just the TDA funds.
thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Other questions? No other questions, comments?
I have a comment. I'm absolutely shocked at the price of this. I had absolutely no idea that it was going to be this expensive. I'm concerned about our general fund and how we're going to be able to afford this. Do you have any information on that and whether or not there's a fund that we can create to mitigate some of these costs, whether or not, if you folks know if there's any more grants that are available to this?
Like Taylor mentioned, there are a variety of different grants that we can or will be looking at to cover a lot of these costs. Again, for purposes of this presentation, we didn't want to do an assumption of, we're going to get this grant that's going to cover 40% or 60% of the cost. We were looking more at like, this is sort of like what this is going to cost, so that we then now have to go out and see, how many grants and even like, discussions with VCTC of, like if they're going to partner with us and have vehicles that they need to charge, a discussion about, cost sharing for the infrastructure cost. And as mentioned too, this rollout plan is it's a work in progress or a living document that, this is at this moment, this is how we're proposing to move forward, but we are still also, and it's also due to the state by July 1st. That doesn't mean that we're not going to continue to do like more research or look into other, like if there are other options that might pop up where suddenly we're like, oh, we could do maybe this other item that might be less expensive, whether it be like another partnership or another site becomes available or something like that. But again, we'll have to discuss with, one of the main items is discussing with SCE and their Charge Ready program, which may help to cover a significant amount of the infrastructure cost for the charging.
I want to add one other thing. What we haven't shown on here is, we focus on the capital cost. We haven't talked about operating costs. We have looked at those, and we do expect pretty significant operational cost savings. Cost of electricity versus the cost of gasoline, probably, I have to double check the numbers, but probably upwards of 50% savings that I believe, and if I remember correctly, the Roadrunners, the operator, they'd pass that cost through directly, so that's a direct cost savings that you guys would see. Those are operation cost savings that maybe you could use to create a fund to help, offset some of the higher capital costs down the road. And the same for maintenance costs. We expect those to be about 30% less than under current ICE vehicles.
Okay. I should ask if there's any public comment on this item. Seeing nobody come forward. All right, any more comments or questions from the council?
I'll make one more comment if I may. I'm in favor of electrification. I'm going to consider myself an environmentalist here. This is a heavy cost, and I'm not sure that it was thoroughly conveyed to us about how much this is going to cost here. I understand too that we have very little options as to go forward with this, but we're going to have to sharpen our pencil, and it's going to take a lot of work, a lot of heavy lifting to make this thing financially work, and that is a concern of mine. So those are my comments now. Hopefully there'll be more grants. Hopefully the cost of these vehicles will go down in time as they get more and more, kind of like computers and some other ones. This is somewhat cutting edge technology. Hopefully there'll be a lot less in the future, but right now it's a lot of money, and as a council member that concerns me. So again, let's all work together and see how we can do this successfully.
At this point, I wanted to, Vice Mayor Tremblay had suggested an amendment, and I'm going to have the city attorney read.
Did you want, okay, so this is what he has asked for. It appears on page 2 of the plan, and it is section B. I believe he requested it would fall at the end of the third paragraph that ends with included in the appendix. So he would like this added. This plan is intended to act as a roadmap to guide CAT through the zero-emission bus transition to a 100% zero-emission bus fleet by 2040. The plan fulfills the existing regulatory requirements of the California Air Resources Board. However, this plan is intended to be a living document with its implementation by the city, subject to change depending on various factors, including but not limited to regulatory changes, financial conditions, and zero-emission technological and infrastructure constraints. This plan will be reviewed on an annual basis.
Mayors? Oh.
Yes, go ahead.
So I do support the zero-emission bus rollout plan. And, I do sit on the Transportation Committee, and I am new and I'm learning a whole lot. But one of the questions that I did ask was regarding grants as well. So I do appreciate that the rollout plan on those 2 pages, page 10 and 11, really delineate, what the funding source would be, the grants that are out there and the time. So it looks like there are significant grants that we can apply for, so I remain a little more hopeful. And for that reason, I will move to approve it, but I would like to also move to approve it with Mr. Tremblay's recommendation from the language that was added. I think it's important to add that this is a living document that we can continue to have control over and continue to revise as needed.
I'll second the motion.
All right. We have a motion and a second. With that, please vote. And that passes 4-1 with one absent. Okay. And that brings us down to item R, which is Building and Safety Plan Check. Joe Vaca?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Santangelo and City Council. Charles Abbott and Associates provides building and safety services for the city. This includes plan check, permit issuance, inspections, documentation, and records management. On May 13th of 2020, the City Council did approve the professional services agreement with Charles Abbott and Associates for a period of 3 years, from July 1st of 2020 through June 30th of 2023. And this includes the option for 2 one-year extensions with City Council approval. Staff is recommending that the City Council does approve the First Amendment to extend the agreement with CAA beginning July 1st of 2023 through June 30th of next year for building and safety services. And this would include a recommended revision of the compensation schedule. So the agreement with CAA provides compensation by a tiered percentage of all building fees collected, which does also include plan check fees. And the fees are based on adopted fee schedule that was established by City Council resolution in 2007. Building and safety permit fees are not being adjusted and they're not being increased with this action. Fees have not been increased since 2007. Due to inflation costs that have increased over the course of this current agreement, the current revenue received by CAA has not been sufficient to provide the level of service required by the city to meet the high level of activity. And CAA has therefore requested an increase in the percentage of fees collected and owed to CAA to cover their staffing costs. So the proposal for the one-year extension is changing the compensation schedule to a 2-tier system, with the amount of percentage of fees collected and owed to CAA being increased by 10% in each tier. And the proposal also includes that 100% of the plan check costs be passed through as compensation for services rendered to CAA. The proposed change results in an increase in revenue to CAA that will cover costs for services and will also be a decrease to the city's portion. The scope of work for CAA will be consistent with the original agreement. In the upcoming fiscal year, staff will be conducting a formal fee nexus study, and that will also be preceded by a request for proposal from firms that are interested in conducting services for the city. We anticipate that any future agreements will be drafted to include annual fee increases based on CPI, and it'll also include periodic fee nexus studies within 3 to 5 year timeframes. And the fee nexus study will include the city's direct and indirect costs, and it will also include the consultant's rate and time to provide service delivery for building and safety services. So with that, staff is recommending that the City Council authorize the city manager to execute the first agreement to the amendment with Charles Abbott and Associates for building and safety services.
Thank you, Mr. Vaca. Do we have comments? Mr. Kildee?
So as I understand it correctly, Mr. Vaca, we have not looked at the fee structure since about 2007.
Yes.
Is there a reason for that? Was it mutually exclusive with Charles? See, what happened we were at the county at one time, and then Charles Abbott and Associates came over, I believe in the late 90s, if I'm not mistaken, and we contracted out for Charles Abbott and Associates. So within that realm, if we haven't looked at it from 2007, was it mutually agreeable with Charles Abbott and Associates that what we were doing was the right thing to be doing? Or is it just something we just
It was,
Didn't
and
do.
with this latest agreement that we started in 2020, we did anticipate doing a fee nexus study over the course of this current agreement.
And when did we become aware of this issue with them?
We've been tracking building permit fee costs for the last 3 years.
About 3 years ago. So how has their quality of service
Very good,
been?
very good.
And that has remained consistent?
Yes, the
through the time,
customer.
even
service
with,
is very
some personnel changes and whatnot, their level of service has always been at a high level.
Yes, they're very timely, very responsive, and the customers rave about the services they receive, so it's been very good.
And we're talking about going out and doing a fee report at some point here, and then perhaps opening it up for, future bids. Is that still, and if that's the case, how long will that study take to conclude?
We hope to have that done within the next fiscal year.
Okay, so you'll start on that rather soon.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Comments, questions? Okay.
I'll move approval of staff's recommendation.
I'll second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Please vote. And that passes 4-1 with one absence. Okay, that brings us down to our public hearings. Our first one is item S, Camarillo Landscape Maintenance District Zones 1 through 10. You're back.
Good news is that this is a much shorter presentation. So good evening, Mayor Santangelo and council members. Tonight I'll be before you is the annual resolution ordering the levying and collection of assessments in the city's landscape maintenance districts. The assessments are structured to cover the city's costs to maintain the landscaping and related improvements included in each zone. Here we have zones 2 through 10 shown within the city of Camarillo. Zone 1, which is the city's initial maintenance district, is not shown on this map. The engineer's report outlines the findings of the assessment engineer in determining the appropriate assessments to be levied in zones 2 through 10. In this table, the zones with an asterisk, shown here, for example, with zone 5, indicates a zone that does not have an escalator clause. This means that any proposed increase above the maximum assessment would require a property owner vote through the Prop 218 process. For fiscal year 23-24, the engineer's report recommends an increase in zones 4, 5, and 8, identified here in red. While Zone 5 does not have an escalator clause, the proposed rate increase of $100 from $90 does not require a Prop 218 vote, as the maximum assessment that can be collected for this zone is $112.36. Also note that Zone 1 is not included in this list, as it is the city's initial maintenance district, which was formed as a tax district where a portion of property taxes are collected to this zone. City Council may recall that last year the city attempted to increase assessments for Zone 3, which is the Armitos Basin. The proposal was to increase the assessment from $69.24 to $140. The residents on Zone 3 voted in opposition to the increases. Consequently, the city's general fund is projected to subsidize Zone 3's maintenance a little over $3,900 for fiscal year 22-23 and $3,847 in fiscal year 23-24 for a combined subsidy of a little under $8,000. While Zone 3 is not fully funded, the remaining zones will be fully funded through collected assessments and accumulated fund balances. Tonight provides the public hearing requirements for the fiscal year 23-24 assessments for all zones. At this time, staff's recommendation is to adopt a resolution ordering the levy and collection of assessments for the Camarillo Lighting and Landscape Maintenance District Zones 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, as shown in the engineer's report. This concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions that council may have. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? Mr. Kildee.
Yeah, thank you. Is this the highest amount that we can adopt tonight within the confines of the 218?
Sorry, with regards to which particular zone?
All of them?
All of,
Yeah.
So So several of the zones have, because they have escalator clauses, we also increase what's called the maximum assessment that can be collected. So that is, several of those do have a higher amount that could be charged, like legally per se. However, when you look at the engineer's assessment and what our costs are, as well as what our fund balance is for those zones, it doesn't warrant increasing the rates more than what we have proposed, in particular for the 3 zones, again, to fully cover the cost for those projected cost for those zones.
So what's the equation? In other words, we're trying to get as much cost recovery as possible on all of these zones.
Yes.
For services rendered, if you will. In this case, it's maintenance. Is that correct?
Yes, most of these zones, it's maintenance of landscaping. A couple of the zones have like detention basins or retention basins that have to be maintained, but that's predominantly what the funding is for.
And that hasn't changed over the years. That's what it's for.
Correct, yeah, it funds what their intended purpose is. Yeah.
Okay, that's all I have.
Any other questions? Mr. Tennyson?
So am I to understand that in Zone 3, the Armidos Basin, 6924 is the max assessment that can be applied there?
Correct. Yes.
Forever?
Barring them voting for an increase or a sudden change in Prop 218 regulations, yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
So,
Okay.
I want to follow up on that. So with that, we basically maintain that zone to the level of revenue and/or dollars that we have to maintain that zone the best we can. Is that fair?
It is fair. I'll mention, I mean, the general fund does subsidize Zone 3 in particular because in Zone 3, it's a couple of detention basins that are there for purposes of flood control and stormwater control. So it's not like we necessarily can't not maintain those because they're essentially there for safety purposes, as opposed to a couple of our other zones where it's landscaping. If we wanted to, we could cut water, we could stop the amount of time that we're performing to the level of how much funding we have for it. But again, for Zone 3, because it's more of a safety concern, I mean, we're certainly not going above and beyond what we have to do, but we do want to keep those detention basins operable for purposes of safety.
Thanks for the clarification.
Okay, this is a public hearing, so I will open the public hearing. Would anybody like to speak to the council? Seeing nobody come forward, I will close the public hearing.
I'll move staff recommendation.
I'll second.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Please vote. And that passes 4-1 with 1 absence. And that will bring us to our next public hearing, which is item T, resolution establishing new user fee for electronic vehicle charging stations. Mr. Thomas?
Yes, good evening, Your Honor and members of the City Council. My name is John Thomas, Assistant Director of Administrative Services. The item before you tonight is the adoption of a resolution to establish an electric vehicle charging station fee. This item is a public hearing and has been properly noticed to the public. I'd like to begin by providing a quick background on what has led up to tonight's fee adoption. In affirming the goal to provide cost-effective, efficient services to the public while minimizing impacts on the environment, the City Council established a specific objective to evaluate the transition of public transit and general use city vehicles and the infrastructure necessary to support them. Further, the Council adopted Resolution 2021-103, authorizing staff to pursue grants, rebates, and other opportunities to fund the installation of infrastructure supporting zero-emission vehicles. So recognizing that a transition to an electrified fleet would require the necessary infrastructure, on January 26, 2022, the City Council authorized the city's participation in Southern California Edison's Charge Ready program and approved the purchase of related equipment and installation. Under the Charge Ready program, SCE covered the costs of designing and building the necessary make-ready infrastructure up to the charging station stub-outs. Working with SCE, 3 sites were selected to be equipped with charging station infrastructure and equipment. In total, 56 charging ports have been installed across the 3 city locations: City Hall with 22 ports, Corporation Yard with 20 ports, and the Camarillo Public Library with 14 ports. At each site, the city was responsible for the purchase, installation, and maintenance of the above-ground charging station equipment. And it has been our intention to make these stations available to the public and staff in addition to the city's electric fleet vehicles. The charging station project is now complete, and the final consideration in the operation of the EV chargers now is to establish a user fee for the stations. The amount of the user fee is determined at the city's discretion, and it is not regulated by SAE or ChargePoint, which is the network and equipment provider. Staff surveyed several other agencies and found that fees range from 24 cents a kilowatt hour to 32 cents a kilowatt hour, which is equal to about $1.58 to $2.11 for 1 hour of charging time. Based on our expected SCE time of use billing rate plan, the city will receive a monthly bill of approximately $350 as a flat rate and a peak usage rate of 19 cents a kilowatt hour. Users will pay at the charging station either through a credit card or the ChargePoint app. ChargePoint collects the fees and will keep 10% of all fee transactions as their service fee. The remainder is passed back to the city on a monthly basis. To cover the costs of ChargePoint service fee, SCE's flat rate, maintenance and operation of the stations, other agencies have added a 10-cent a kilowatt hour to their use rate. Following in line with these agencies, staff recommends setting the charging use rate fee at 29 cents a kilowatt hour, which is 10 cents higher than the city's peak use rate, in range with other charging station costs in our local area, and provides for coverage of service fees and maintenance costs. It should be noted, though, that overall utilization of the charging stations will determine if the rate is able to cover the associated costs of operation, and because of this, staff will be closely monitoring each station's usage and will be prepared to make future rate recommendations. At the 29-cent kilowatt rate, a driver of an electric vehicle that has a battery capacity of 100 kilowatt hours, very similar to a Tesla S model, could expect to charge 40% of their battery at a cost of $11.60, or 100% of their battery for $29. As far as the city's fleet, the city's existing and future existing fleet vehicles will be able to charge at no cost to the driver through the use of a ChargePoint provided fleet card. Of course, fleet costs will still be paid by the city through the monthly SCE bill. Also, the electric vehicle charging station fee will apply to the stations located at the Corporation Yard, although their availability will not be advertised to the public. Again, staff will monitor charging usage statistics at the 3 sites through a ChargePoint online dashboard, and will be able to make informed user fee recommendations in the future as needed. Following tonight's resolution adoption, staff is preparing community messaging, including a press release for tomorrow morning, a posting on our city's Facebook page, and a notification in the next City Scene newsletter. This concludes my presentation, and I'm available for any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Thomas. Do we have any questions?
I have a quick question. The company that, remind me the name of the company, sorry.
It's ChargePoint.
ChargePoint. So they take 10% whether you use the app or a credit card?
That's correct.
Correct, okay. Thank you.
Mr. Kildee?
Okay. So give me a little timeline here, John. So when we installed those, it was mostly paid for by Edison and a grant that we got for the installation.
Yes, so Edison did take on the large share of installing all of the infrastructure and took the burden of those costs. It was about an 80-20 cost share with them, where 80% would have been the amount of cost for the infrastructure, and then the 20% represents all the above-ground equipment that was on the city to purchase.
And we basically paid for the 20% of that for the most part. Okay, so if there's a $350 flat rate, and there's about, I think it's somewhere about 18 cents or so a kilowatt per hour, right? Those are fixed costs, if you will. I mean, those things are just that we're going to have to incur. So my question on that is, if we're trying to break even, the difference of what you're suggesting that we charge here, is that our maintenance cost totally what it costs us to maintain this and overhead or whatever else that you want to spread this
So that
along?
10 cents will actually go toward paying for that 350 flat rate, as well as the 10% portion that ChargePoint keeps, and have some for maintenance and operations.
Okay, so full disclosure, I do not have an electric car. Are most electric car drivers, do they pay something for their charging stations? I mean, in other words, if they're somewhere, do they encourage a fee for this? Is
Yes,
there a charge?
we went through many different locations with charging stations. They all have a fee in some fashion. Some will offer, I mean, and it runs the gamut. Like I said, it's not like it's regulated. You can pretty much choose the fee that you want to set. But from what we've seen, it seems to be that our 29 cent a kilowatt hour is within that range. You may find some that are free, but then they actually charge for the time that you leave your car sit and you're not actually charging, but you're occupying the space. So some fees are based on that. It just depends on the property owner and their approach to how they want to handle the fee.
Okay, maybe somebody can answer this next question. If you have a Tesla, which we have a Tesla dealership here in Camarillo, and you go to their charging station, is there a fee for that?
So yes, I know that, I do have a Tesla, full disclosure. But when Tesla, several years ago, when they were just taking off, they were offering a deal where you were able to charge at any Tesla charging station for free. But that ended. So by the time I purchased my vehicle, we do have to pay a fee. And we typically charge at home, but you do have to pay a fee.
So, John, in your opinion here and the research, I know you've done some pretty intense research on this amount of fee that is proposed here is in line with what others are charging?
It is. Thousand Oaks is 26 cents, Simi Valley 24 cents, City of Carpinteria is 30 cents, County of Ventura, the government center, it's they actually charge 32 cents while it's not charging, while it's just occupying a space. Ventura County Office of Education in Camarillo here is 40 cents. Disneyland is 35 cents. I mean, our 29 cents is right in line.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
I'd like to move staff's recommendation.
This is a public hearing, so stand by. I will open the public hearing. Do we have any public comments? Seeing none, I will close the public hearing.
I move staff's recommendation.
I will second.
All right, we have a motion and a second. Please vote. And that passes 4-1 with one absence. Okay, so this brings us to the end of our agenda. Do we have a closed session report?
I believe we're returning to closed session?
We are.
Yes, okay, thanks.
So no report. Okay, so with that, we will adjourn back into closed session.